Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the B2B Club. My name is Ollie, and I work in the marketing team here at Hokodo. And in this month's episode, we're going to be looking at some recently announced draft legislation that is likely to have a big impact on B2B trade and, in particular, B2B payments. So today we're going to be focusing on PSD3, which was announced by the European Commission earlier in June this year. And it's an ambitious piece of draft legislation to update the existing Payment Services Directive known as PSD2. So PSD2 was initially introduced in 2016 and is effectively a piece of EU legislation for all electronic payment services and aims to make payments more secure for consumers and businesses, as well as to boost innovation and competition within the industry. So PSD3 has emerged in response to the considerable growth of digital payments and transactions, with electronic payments reaching a value of 240 trillion euros in 2021, which was, of course, largely driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and also the rise of new fintechs and payment methods such as buy now, pay later, which really came onto the scene after PSD2 was introduced. And yeah, so on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the proposals outlined in PSD3 and the impacts that they're going to have on existing legislation and also B2B merchants and marketplaces and other sort of payment service providers within the EU. So to help me today, I'm joined by Hokodo's Head of Legal and Compliance, Nat Hoon, who I must say certainly has a far superior knowledge and understanding of the topic than I do. So very happy to have you here with me today, Nat. Yeah, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about your role at Hokodo.
Cool. So hi, I'm Nathalie, Head of Legal and Compliance at Hokodo. I guess this is a really interesting topic for us. Hokodo has just acquired an EMI business in Lithuania. So, our first client went live using our license last week, which is a really, really exciting time to be here. I guess in terms of background, I trained traditionally. I was a traditional finance lawyer, supported clients with debt offerings, very much in the traditional world, large corporates. Tesco was a big client of mine for a long time, and worked really in the traditional banking sector, HSBC, Barclays, the large banks. Made a move into fintech around 4 or 5 years ago. Haven't looked back since. Both of the companies that I've worked for have had EMIs or been associated with EMIs, because it's really where finance is changing the most, and that is partly led by pieces of legislation like the Payment Services Directive, PSD2, and now PSD3 coming through and allowing for that innovation in the financial services market.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the intro. It's good to have you on the podcast today. So I think maybe a good place to start would be not actually with PSD3 itself, but with PSD2, which is the piece of legislation that precedes it and has been in place since, I think, 2016. So can you maybe just give a brief overview of PSD2 and sort of the changes that it introduced?
So, Ollie, I'm actually going to go a step back. If you think that PSD2 is number 2, I'll go back straight to PSD. So the Payment Services Directive, the initial Payment Services Directive was introduced, I think, around 2007, 2008. And the aim was to, contribute or create a single payment market in the European Union. It really goes to the fundamentals of what the EU is trying to do, which is to create a single market. And that includes in the financial services businesses. The aim was to promote innovation and to promote competition and efficiency. Something that if you have ever opened a bank account with a traditional banking provider, whilst, there's loads of pros to working with someone like Barclays, they can't move that quickly because they're such large organizations. And that was really the aim of the first payments directive, was to create a system that allowed for change. And that really did happen. And it has happened in a huge way. So actually a really successful piece of legislation. I think then when PSD2 came out, again, similarly to PSD3, which we'll go into in more detail, the aim was to enhance the effectiveness of these additional payment services that were coming through. So to offer, to improve consumer protections. So any customers that were using these payment services businesses, again, more competition, more innovation, and reinforce security in the payment sector. We will all remember the moment that strong customer authentication came in, when suddenly we were having to, receive a text message to check into our bank accounts, or, doing your finger ID or whatever it is. But But that was led in part by PSD2 coming in and saying, actually, we need more steps to make these things more secure. And it's had an impact on the whole market, not just on the payment services providers.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, I think when I was sort of doing some research for this episode, I looked into the, strong customer authentication, and I guess I didn't really realize that was a thing. It wasn't a thing until before I like researched the episode. So yeah, it's a good point. And so what do you think some of the biggest successes or achievements that have come about as a result of PSD2?
I mean, I think it has to be disruption. It's disruption in the market. PSD2, it's everybody now has their apps on their phone, because that allowed technology to disrupt the financial services market, which historically had not been at the forefront, shall we say, of of sort of new technology. So I think that has been the biggest success for me. And I think in a secure environment, in that if you asked a lot of people, though maybe it's generational, but lots of people would say that Revolut is as trustworthy as Barclays for what they're using the banking system for. Maybe, there are elements that aren't, but actually holding their funds, they're fine for them to be with Revolut as opposed to Barclays. And I think that has been really, really important. I think another area that has started in the EU and hasn't really taken off, and again, we're going to talk about that when we talk about PSD3, is open banking, the ability to do account-to-account payments, fundamentally circumventing or without the need to use the card payment system, which reduces costs to both consumers and businesses, or reduces cost to businesses, which in part reduces cost to customers. For me, I think that was a really novel piece of legislation that came in with the EU saying, look, this is really great, actually technological way of doing things, of open banking, sharing data and, sharing payment systems or ways of making payments. And that still hasn't caught on yet, I would say, not as a mass market, but I think it's definitely going in that direction. And it's something that at Hokodo, we're really, really looking at opening that avenue for our customers, for our customers to be able to receive payments from their buyers using open banking, because it's just so much cheaper. I mean, the costs are basically nil. So that's just how attractive it is in comparison to paying with a card, where your costs could be 2 or 3%. I think that's a really, is really important, but there's still a lot more work to do on that. Again, as I said, strong customer authentication, especially in the world of digital finance, where there's so much more, you can access through your phone, online, through a website. We aren't going to the bank anymore with our passport to say, please, can I get some money out? Everything's being done online. It's automated. It's not even with chip and pin isn't even being used anymore. So that's, that level of protection, it just needed to change. Actually, it's just, again, strong customer authentication is about, do you know who your customer is that's spending this money? And what it's done is digitized something that maybe previously had been a face-to-face interaction with, other ways of verifying who you are, should you be making that payment? I think there's some really great data about this, and it suggests that consumers save roughly 900 billion euros in fraud losses as a result of changes from PSD2, which is phenomenal across Europe for that impact. So security is, it's vital in the financial services business, especially when we're, spending more money, to be frank with you. And I think just to go back to the point, I really think that innovation has been awesome. I think, that's why we're here. That's why I'm in a fintech. It's why I'm really excited to be working in a business that has an EMI, is because we are able to offer our services across Europe. Every single merchant, more or less, in Europe can utilize Hokodo's payment services. And that is because we have an EMI that is passported into every country in the EU. We can support buyers in the EU, outside the EU. That's amazing in a financial services world where historically each country determined their own system. Your historical banks have some services they can passport into other countries, but it's actually really difficult for them to do that. So yeah, payment services really is an innovation.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Nat. So now we've covered a bit around PSD and PSD2. I was just wondering if you could, share some more thoughts about why PSD3 has evolved and why the European Commission has decided to introduce the proposed changes.
Yeah, I think it's really sort of really interesting. And actually, I was reading an article on the European Payments Council website about this. And I think we have to say, someone was quoted, and I'm going to misquote this, but I'm saying the proposals are an evolution, not a revolution. And, as we said, open banking, strong customer authentication, they were introduced by PSD2, but the market has moved, payments have moved, and so we should see this as a continuation of PSD2, not a change of direction. So really, that's what the aim of PSD3 is trying to do, is an evolution. It's ensuring that we are still protecting customers in the way in which they're using their financial services, customers being businesses or individual customers. Open banking is not yet adopted sort of really widely, and that's partly because it's an incredibly complicated system. Like, I don't even pretend to understand the technicalities of open banking. I used to work with a CTO who was very, very well versed in the open banking setup, and it to me is really a technological invention. It's ensuring that data is shared securely. It's ensuring that payments are done securely, and there needs to be more work done on that to ensure that players in the market are trusting open banking, not just the banks themselves, not just the EMIs, but the merchants. They understand what it means, and they understand why their payments are still secure when they use open banking. Again, something that Hokodo, as I said earlier on, is working on. Creating this open banking. And I think once we have mass adoption in the B2B market, that will absolutely change payments, because B2C customers are spending small amounts, B2B customers are spending big amounts. That would be large amounts of money transferring using account to accounts, and I think that'll be really, really interesting. I think another thing from a sort of a legal position is that historically we've had a distinction between payment services businesses and EMIs because of the way in which the legislation was drafted. EMIs will be sort of embedded, or the EMI legislation will be embedded into PSD3. I think that's just helpful, because having to explain the distinction between the two is it's just painful. So I'm looking forward to that on a personal basis. I think there are a few, again, when I look at the changes, they're not wholesale. They will improve the way in which payment services businesses are ran. One of the things that's really exciting about Hokodo and what we can offer for our merchants is that we safeguard their funds. So any customer funds that are, any merchant funds that are held with Hokodo will be kept in a safeguarded account. Ours is actually with the central bank where we're regulated. So it's pretty difficult to get access to them. And one of the things that PSD3 is going to do is improve the regulatory technical standards on safeguarding requirements. So I think that is really, really valuable to our customers to understand that we are looking after their funds. And actually, in the B2B market, in the BNPL market, so the Buy Now Pay Later, or even trade credit, actually most or lots of our competitors are not regulated. Or lots of the traditional players are not regulated because they haven't had to be in certain countries. And that's a real advantage to Hokodo, is having that regulation behind us, which means we are looking after customer funds in a very high standard.
One of the things I was reading as well was about the introduction of PSD3 is the PSR, which I think is the payment service regulation. So is that, can you just maybe go into a bit more detail about that? Is that PSD2 is becoming a directive, is becoming a regulation? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think, again, sort of very technical point from a legal perspective. The intention from the drafting so far is that PSD3 and PSR will sit alongside each other. For all of the legal boffins out there, a regulation is directly effective or directly applicable into all 26 countries, whereas a directive will be implemented individually into each of the member states. The advantage of having a regulation, so PSR, is that there should be more consistency across the board in terms of the way in which services are offered. Again, like, we're looking at this point of having a single market. not a single one of Hokodo's customers, and all the customers that come to us and say we'd like to work with Hokodo are based just in one country in the EU. Like, they are based across the EU and obviously also into the UK. And so having a consistency of service is really important to ensure that they can offer the same services, you know, to a buyer in Spain as they can in Holland. And, you know, really hoping that some of what the PSR will do is identify the points at which there are differences, and, you know, subject to acceptance by the member states, will you know, close down the differing of the ways in which payment services have to be offered to different buyers in different countries.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's clear. And I think, yeah, you touched on it a little bit there about sort of the UK as well. Obviously, Hokodo is based in the UK and also in Europe as well. I was just wondering if there's, you know, post-Brexit, is there going to be any changes or differentiations in how it will be adopted, or does the UK have to adopt it? Or yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I will be fascinated to see what the UK's response to this is, because until now, you know, by and large, the UK has followed a similar track to the rest of the EU, even post Brexit. Of course, there has always been differentiators in the UK. The FCA regulate EMIs in a different way to the way in which the Dutch regulator does, in the different way to the way BaFin does, etc. That has always been a position. Obviously, this will be, you know, another step further. I guess what I would expect to see is actually a raising of standards in the UK in response to PSD3, not through legislation, actually just through practical aspects. You know, when I talk about PSD3, when I'm talking about open banking, we're talking about protecting customers' funds, safeguarding. A lot of these are technical requirements. And I think that in the back end, lots of fintech players, lots of payment services will just say, actually, we'll just raise the standard across for UK customers as well as our EU customers. You know, if you're gold plating something, if you're making something better, you know, from a you know, they don't want to have two products running aside from each other. From a technical perspective, I think that the standard will also be raised in the UK, to be quite honest with you. You know, that's certainly, again, something that we do at Hokodo, is that, you know, we try to operate the business in the same manner for the UK as we do for the EU. So you know, I could see that would also happen for other players. I think the interesting point that's been raised by PSD3 is that, you know, there is a suggestion that they will be looking at challenging new entrants to the market. So, you know, making the bar slightly higher to get your licenses, and, you know, expecting a little bit more of the companies that are already there, again, from a technical perspective. So I don't know whether the UK will become more attractive again, to be quite honest with you, for maybe businesses that don't quite think they can reach the EU standards. But it's very hard to know, because a lot of these things will be very practical. I can't see at the moment that the FCA would be running to make changes to their, you know, their piece of legislation, it's the EMRs in the UK, in response to PSD3. But, you know, let's see what happens.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how it all rolls out. And I guess, yeah, that sort of leads on quite well to the next question, is sort of, what is the time frame for PSD3? Sort of, when are we expected to see? I know you say it's an evolution, but when do you think we'll see the next evolution come into fruition?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is why it's difficult to answer in too much detail. But obviously, what we've received at the moment is very much in draft form. You know, both PSD3 and PSR will now go through the usual EU legislative processes, which can take 2 years or so to complete. Based on current proposals, I think 18 to 24 months realistically to enter into force. You know, we could be looking at 25, 26. I think it will be interesting to watch when PSD3 comes in and PSRs, because, as we said before, PSRs are directly applicable, whereas PSD3s, then the member states have to implement them into local law. So whether there'll be a sort of slightly longer grace period on the PSRs in order to allow also member states to get PSD3 in as well. But again, very much led by, some of it can even be led by what's going on else, in the country at the time.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so thanks. I think we've got sort of quite a good overview of it there. There's going to be impacts or changes in both the B2C and the B2B world. But I was wondering if there was maybe a certain element or change that we will see in the world of B2B payments as a result of PSD3.
I would love to see the adoption of more open banking payments or account-to-account payments. That's something that I actually feel really passionate about in terms of its effectiveness in the market, in terms of cutting costs for businesses. So, that is obviously something that also the European Union feel quite strongly about, that it's really effective for businesses in order to encourage trade, to reduce competitiveness, etc., or reduce anti-competitive behaviour. So I think that could be something that has a big impact on B2B businesses. And, if we have clients listening to this or potential clients, our team is working on this and would love to have a conversation with you to get you comfortable with what open banking payments are or what account-to-account payments are. So that's the really big takeaway from me from a B2B perspective.
Yeah, I think we did a webinar recently with our open banking provider, and their founder, he seemed quite excited by the future possibilities, especially for SMEs or sole traders as well. I think it's a real big benefit, open banking. So hopefully that will, lead to some good changes in the future.
Yeah, I think also, B2C has been very quick to adopt EMIs or adopt the use of EMIs in PSPs. And we've seen such a big change in the B2B market in the last few years, the adoption of PSPs and marketplaces. And so the next step, I do think, for B2B, both direct sale merchants and marketplaces, is the adoption of ancillary financial services to those traditional payment services, which is, businesses like Hokodo saying, look, we can connect with you and maybe the PSP that you're already working with. If you're already working with Stripe, actually, Hokodo is a great add-on to that. So that would be the second place that I would see it. I think as we go through this exercise of increased technological scrutiny and increased security for business, increased ability to do account-to-account payments, that sort of second step of ancillary financial services, I think, will be really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think sort of one last question. I think you mentioned earlier about Hokodo recently acquired an EMI in Lithuania earlier this year. So yeah, just wondering if you could share some of the implications that these changes might have for us as a business on the EMI specifically.
I mean, to be quite frank with you, I hope to, our merchants, this is not going to have a huge impact. This is something for, the legal and compliance team to focus on, the tech team to focus on, their internal technical improvements, to be quite honest with you. But I hope what this means for the market more broadly is that B2B merchants are coming to us and saying, look, Hokodo, we see that you're regulated. That's a great offering for us. We know that being regulated under the PSD3 is an advantage, and we see that there are all these technical strengths to working with a business like ours that is agile but secure. So actually, it's as much about reputation, I think, as it is about technical change for the merchants.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, I think we've definitely done a good job on covering all the bases here today. I've definitely learned a lot from this episode and also doing all the research behind it. So yeah, it's been really great. And yeah, Nat, just like to say massive thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your expertise with everyone today. So yeah, it's been great to have you. Yeah, and also like to thank everyone for listening, tuning in to another episode of the B2B Club. We hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. So yeah, we can look forward to seeing you on the next episode.